Martin Luther, the German monk and theologian, is known for initiating the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. One of his most controversial actions was his decision to remove 7 books from the Old Testament. These books, Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Sirach, Ecclesiasticus, Baruch, and 1 and 2 Maccabees, are known as the deuterocanonical books. While they were included in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, and had been part of Christian Bibles for over 1,000 years, Luther rejected them. He considered them apocryphal, meaning they were not divinely inspired. But why did he remove them? And what was his reasoning? Luther's primary reason for rejecting these books was his belief in sola scriptura, or Scripture alone. He argued that only texts with direct Hebrew origins and clear divine authority should be included in the Bible. Since the deuterocanonical books were not part of the Jewish Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, but were included in the Greek Septuagint, Luther viewed them with skepticism. However, the early Christian church, including Jesus and the apostles, often quoted from the Septuagint. This means that the books Luther removed had historical significance in early Christianity. Another reason Luther removed these books was their doctrinal content. Some passages supported Catholic teachings that he disagreed with, particularly regarding purgatory and prayers for the dead. For example, 2 Maccabees 12:46 speaks about praying for the souls of the dead, a practice that supports the Catholic doctrine of purgatory. Since Luther strongly opposed this teaching, he dismissed the book altogether. His theological disagreements played a key role in shaping which books he considered valid. Luther was also heavily influenced by the Jewish canon of the Old Testament. By the time of the Reformation, Jewish scholars had already settled on a 39-book Hebrew Bible, which did not include the deuterocanonical books. Luther believed that this Jewish canon was the most authentic version of the Old Testament. However, early Christians used the Greek Septuagint, which included these books, making them part of Christian tradition for centuries. Luther's decision was therefore not based on Christian history, but rather on his interpretation of Jewish tradition. While Luther removed these books from his Old Testament, he did not completely discard them. He placed them in a separate section in his German translation of the Bible, calling them Apocrypha. He admitted that they were still useful for reading, but he did not consider them equal to the rest of Scripture. Many later Protestant Bibles followed his example, either removing these books entirely or placing them in a separate section. This created a lasting division between Protestant and Catholic Bibles. In addition to removing 7 books from the Old Testament, Luther also attempted to remove certain New Testament books. He questioned the validity of Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation, calling them disputed books. Luther especially disliked James because it emphasized works alongside faith, James 2:24, which contradicted his belief in salvation by faith alone. However, despite his objections, these books remained in Protestant Bibles. Luther's decision had a significant impact on Christianity. Before the Reformation, the Catholic Church used the Latin Vulgate Bible, which included the deuterocanonical books. The Council of Trent, 1546, later reaffirmed these books as part of the official Catholic canon in response to the Protestant Reformation. This solidified the difference between Catholic and Protestant Bibles. Today, Catholic and Orthodox Christians continue to include these books, while most Protestant Bibles omit them. Many scholars argue that Luther's actions were based more on personal theology than historical evidence. The deuterocanonical books were widely used by early Christians, and many church fathers quoted from them. By removing them, Luther was effectively reshaping the Bible to fit his beliefs. His changes led to lasting disagreements over biblical canon and interpretation. The books Luther removed contain valuable historical and spiritual insights. 1 and 2 Maccabees, for example, describe the Jewish revolt against Greek rule and the origins of Hanukkah. The Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach contain profound teachings on righteousness and morality. Despite their removal from Protestant Bibles, these books remain essential to understanding Jewish and Christian history. One of the biggest controversies regarding Luther's decision is that Jesus and the apostles likely read and referenced these books. The New Testament contains allusions to the deuterocanonical books, suggesting that they were part of early Christian teaching. If these books were accepted by the early church, why should they be removed later? This remains a major point of debate among theologians. While Luther's goal was to restore biblical purity, his decision created a lasting division in Christianity. Today, many Christians are unaware that the original Christian Bible contained these books. Some Protestant scholars are now re-evaluating their significance and acknowledging their historical value. However, most Protestant denominations continue to follow Luther's edited canon. Another issue with removing these books is that it weakens certain biblical narratives. The deuterocanonical books provide context for events and teachings in the New Testament. Without them, some theological and historical connections are lost. Their removal means that modern Protestant readers are missing out on texts that shaped early Christian thought. Despite his influence, Luther was not the first to question these books. Some early church fathers debated their status, but they were ultimately included in the Christian canon. The fact that they remained in the Bible for over 1,000 years before Luther's removal shows their significance. His decision was a personal and theological choice rather than a historical necessity. One argument in favor of including the deuterocanonical books is that they align with biblical themes. They emphasize God's justice, wisdom, and mercy, just like the rest of Scripture. Their teachings are consistent with the messages found in the recognized books of the Bible. This further supports their legitimacy as inspired writings. The rejection of these books also raises questions about biblical authority. If one man had the power to remove books from the Bible, what does that mean for the integrity of Scripture? Should biblical canon be determined by historical tradition, or can individuals decide what is valid? These are questions that continue to challenge biblical scholars. The deuterocanonical books were widely accepted for centuries before Luther's reforms. Even after their removal from Protestant Bibles, they continued to be studied and respected by many scholars. Their presence in the Septuagint and early Christian writings proves their importance in biblical history. Many Protestant denominations today ignore or dismiss these books simply because they are not included in their Bibles. However, early Christians did not make such distinctions. The division between Catholic and Protestant Bibles is a relatively recent development in church history. Some Protestant groups have begun reintroducing the deuterocanonical books for study purposes. They recognize their historical and theological significance, even if they do not consider them fully inspired. This reflects a growing awareness of how much these books contribute to biblical understanding. Ultimately, Luther's removal of these books changed the way Christianity understands Scripture. His decision was not universally accepted, and it continues to be debated. Whether or not one accepts these books as Scripture, their influence on Christian history cannot be denied. The question remains, did Luther have the authority to remove these books? While his actions shaped Protestant theology, they also left many questions unanswered. Today, Christians must decide whether to accept his revised canon or explore the broader biblical tradition that existed for over 1,000 years. Luther's decision to remove the deuterocanonical books also affected how certain doctrines were understood. Many Protestant churches, following his lead, rejected teachings such as prayers for the dead and intercession of saints because they were found in these books. This created a significant theological divide between Protestant and Catholic beliefs. If these books had remained in Protestant Bibles, Christian theology might have developed differently. One of the biggest misconceptions is that Luther was the first to question these books. In reality, debates about the biblical canon had existed for centuries before him. However, the early church accepted these books, and they remained part of Christian scripture until the Reformation. By removing them, Luther was not following historical consensus, but redefining biblical authority according to his views. In the end, the removal of these books remains one of the most controversial decisions in Christian history. Whether one accepts them as scripture or not, their historical importance cannot be denied. Luther's influence reshaped the biblical canon for millions, but his decision was not based on a universal consensus. For those seeking a fuller understanding of Christian history and theology, studying these books can provide valuable insights.